Welcome to the Parenting Coach Podcast with Crystal. Over 7 years ago, I felt like I was stuck in this cycle of yelling and reactivity in my parenting that I did not want to be in, but I didn't know how to get out of. I knew how I wanted to parent pretty much exactly, and I'd spent hours reading books, but not finding a way to show up how I wanted to. That's when I started to turn inwards. My own inward journey was what my family needed. As I changed, everything around me changed. My kids' meltdowns decreased by 90% or more with no medications or therapy. I stopped yelling, sibling fighting became almost entirely non-existent, and I found that this change flowed into other areas of my life too. My intuition increased. I started to run my life and business in a very different way. If this sounds like something you want to, I can help. Join me each week as I share my journey, including the laughter, fun, hard times, and tears. Tune in for support, guidance, and fun conversations with my favorite experts, and really anything else that interests me too. Anxiety, ADHD, and school support with Dr. Emily. Neurodivergent kids need to be supported both in the home and in the classroom in order to thrive and grow. ADHD and anxiety seem to be on the rise, but schools aren't always creating the most effective environment for that growth to happen. In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Emily in a conversation around supporting learning in the classroom for neurodivergent kids and how this support can help all kids too. Dr. Emily is a child psychologist and former school psychologist who has worked with neurodivergent children and teens for the last 20 years. She now works in private practice in North Carolina, supporting the mental health needs of neurodivergent youth, their families, and teachers. She also created the Neurodiverse Classroom, which is a professional development curriculum for K-12 educators. She's been featured on Morning Joe, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and has written for parents.com. In this episode, we talk about how to support ADHD and anxiety in our kids and youth. We talk about why anxiety may be on the rise and the power of play. We talk about how our current curriculum does not necessarily align with current child development, and how play-based education is more supportive for our young kids than pushing academics early. How we can advocate for our kids' mental health in the classroom, and when to know if changing schools is needed. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Parenting Coach Podcast today. I have my friend Dr. Emily on today, and I'm excited to talk about this topic. This is one that I haven't brought to the podcast yet. And I think that talking about all issues around neurodiversity and schooling it's happening all the time in my own personal conversations with people. And I really think that this will be a very prevalent topic that it'll just be good. So first of all, before we dig into that, do you want to just introduce yourself a little bit to us? Tell us what you do and who you are.
Thanks so much for having me. So I'm Dr. Emily King. I am a child psychologist in North Carolina. I was originally a school psychologist, so trained in school psychology and worked as a school psychologist in the public schools in Texas. I've been working in private practice, though, for the last 15 years, just because I'm able to do a little bit more than just evaluations, and I'm able to consult with families raising autistic children or children with ADHD, learning differences, twice exceptionality, and all the anxiety that can come with that, because our schooling and our culture and our communities tend to be fairly neurotypical. And so kids and families feel that resistance, and they will feel the stress that can come with their differences, showing up in some of those settings. So in addition to the therapeutic work that we do, I do a lot of navigation with helping parents and my clients, teachers, better understand how to help them lead authentic lives and find their interests and find their strengths and find places where they feel included.
I love that. And before we recorded this, we were talking about a love of learning and trying to create that love of learning and keep that love of learning, and that being the goal. And that is always my goal. And I know that not everybody can homeschool. Not everybody has the situation where that works for them. But I also know that there's people considering it. And I also know there's so many different avenues within, public school, private school, alternative schooling as well. So we're going to dig into that today. But first of all, tell us a little bit about how you even got started with this.
Yeah. So I feel like I just keep following what is most passionate next in my life. And, I originally wanted to be a teacher and I loved education. And then I discovered psychology and thought, oh, you can actually specialize in being a psychologist about learning. This is perfect. Mm-hmm. So that's how I came into school psychology. But then the more you work with kids, and you see these complex presentations I started to realize there were so many things that interfered with learning, behaviors or emotions and mental health concerns, or just developmental differences that were interfering with the child accessing the curriculum that was obviously being taught to them based on their chronological age and not their developmental needs. So I started to get just deeper and deeper into the research and into working with my clients and figuring out how to best support them. And that led me into, working with more complex cases in my psychology practice, but then also with working with teachers and parents, doing some online education. And I do teacher professional development. As we've evolved, I think we're so early in this research. I think that we're just at the beginning of really understanding the complexities that come with neurodivergence, even though we kind of feel like we've been talking about things like ADHD and learning disabilities since like the 90s. But I just think this is such a young field of research. Mm-hmm. And the more we learn, the more we realize that, so many of these strategies are good for every learner. And this flexibility is just so good for everyone. But our system is not really structured that way when it comes to a traditional school. So met with that structure of the traditional school and the very not traditional brains that we have, that we are all different. We're all unique. We're all learning in different ways and have strengths and needs for support that are unique. That's why I just keep being led in these directions to continue talking about this. And then I'm also the mom to two neurodivergent boys who I was a psychologist before I was even a parent. So they have taught me so much. And both my boys are in public schools here. And so I've navigated that as a parent, as well as making sure they have everything they need, but also that as they grow and mature, I'm stepping back and allowing them to self-advocate and learn to get what they need to build that confidence up moving into later teens and adulthood.
Yeah. And I love that you brought in neurotypical kids also, because if anybody's listening to this podcast episode and you're like, oh, but my kids aren't neurodiverse, like they're fairly typical, they're, fairly developmental, their developmental chronological, whatever is like, pretty on par. Like you said, I think this way of thinking and doing things is actually helpful for everyone. And another thing that kind of came up before we started pressing record on this as well was this idea of the curriculum not necessarily matching up with developmental learning. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. And one quick thing about if you're listening and you have neurotypical children, I would encourage you to keep listening, just because not only are some of these strategies helpful for all kids, but also we all have to do a better job helping our kids understand differences. And so I always encourage all parents to listen to podcasts like this or to read blogs about the experiences of these kids and teenagers, because neurodivergence is so prevalent that your kids are in school with peers with ADHD or autistic peers or kids with anxiety. I mean, they know kids and that have different needs, and we just need to all keep talking about that. Yeah. So in terms of chronological age versus developmental, like readiness to learn, we have to put kids in a classroom and give them a curriculum. There are too many children and not enough teachers to teach everybody one-on-one. That is just the reality, right? So how that's evolved over, probably the last 100 years of traditional education is that we group kids by age, because generally speaking, they are ready to learn what everybody's ready to learn at those ages. Well, the differences come in when a child has a disability, a developmental disability. And so, in America in 1975, we created the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and we created, therefore, a special education where we can differentiate, remediate, separate classroom if needed, different ways to provide instruction or to flex the school day. But at the same time, we have the importance of inclusion and the importance of social emotional inclusion. And as much as a child can, be in the classroom with their same age peers, we want them to. Where this gets tricky with neurodivergence is that learning in a big group can be overstimulating and overwhelming for autistic students, or for kids that have sensory sensitivities, or for kids with ADHD who are easily distracted. And so even though they may intellectually be able to learn the curriculum in that big group. They may learn better actually in a smaller group. So this is where we're kind of starting to see that the system doesn't always work. This like special education versus general education divide that worked well when we only needed to change what a child was learning, but it doesn't necessarily work well when we need to change the environment, but not the curriculum, for instance. So this is how when we think about neurodivergence, I always think about asynchronous skills. So every kid's going to have a difference, and like they could be, high achieving in math and need reading support, or they could be a high reader and they need math support. There could be all kinds of differences. And what we need is flexibility. We need teachers to be able to make the decisions that they need to make as the expert in educating that child. They need the flexibility to tweak the environment or tweak the pace of something, because the child can likely all these children can learn, right? They can do it, but they can't do it maybe as fast as someone just because that child is their same age, or as they can't work as long as someone can just because they are the same age. So I hope we're working towards, a system where teachers have more ability to flex and give kids what they need in the general education classroom, and that they don't always have to be removed. But if they do need to be, removed into a smaller classroom temporarily, that there's a benefit to that because it's quieter or it's less distracting. So we need to always make sure that there's a purpose behind any type of strategy we're using.
And I think also when talking about neurotypical kids, talking about that also being developmental, I think that sometimes we're like, okay, well, there's this group of neurodivergent kids and like, it's going to take a little longer. And also there's this group of neurotypical kids and it's like these two bowls. And you're like, no. Like it's so much more complex than that.
It's
and
so
also,
much more complex.
Learning is developmental for every child. So can you talk about the curriculum in regards to that, even the neurotypical kids?
Yeah. I mean, if you speak to any teacher, they'll say like, even within the kids in my classroom who don't have any added supports, they're picking up on things at different times in the school year, reading clicks for them at a variety of different times. And the goal is to like have them all ready by the end of the year, but there's still got to be some flexibility with that. And so, and that's why, I think when I talk about some of these things with teachers, I do get some feedback sometimes where people say, well, that's just already stuff that like a quote unquote good teacher would do. And I'm like, yes, that is true, but that's not intuitive to all teachers. So we want to make sure that even, before we got on, the podcast recording, we were talking about just the variability in 6-year-olds is huge, like neurotypical 6-year-olds, like they could be coming into the school building and they've never even been to school before. Or you might have a child who's been in daycare since 6 weeks old, and their experiences of life and learning in a group, even if it's been play, are going to be completely different. They're going to be, have different attachment experiences to caregivers and teachers than a child who's been home. And neither one of those is right or wrong. It's just a different experience coming to the school building. And then we're asking them all to do the same thing when we get them into kindergarten or into first grade. So we really just need to think about where kids are coming in terms of their exposure and their skill level, and then flexing that with, and I want teachers to have all the flexibility they can. And yes, they're tasked with getting this learning into the child's brain, but all the different ways to do it. It's just so helpful for teachers to have that flexibility.
Yeah. And one thing you said before the podcast too, was like that K-2 age, like the curriculum isn't necessarily lining up with what development is actually happening as well. Right. So we're like, okay, we should read earlier and earlier and earlier, even though like that's not actually a developmentally appropriate thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was in graduate school 20 plus years ago. And so back then, it was, we weren't quite yet pushing reading this young as we are now. It's kind of happened over the last 20 years where reading just gets pushed down into the kindergarten curriculum. And so of course that's time taken away from play. And we know that 5-year-olds need to be playing. We know that 6-year-olds really still need to be playing. And that is not just about playing. It's about moving their body and emotional regulation and problem solving socially. And all of those things are helpful to the comprehension skills that they need as they get older and they're reading stories. I say this all the time, that reading comprehension is really social comprehension. They're just reading the story rather than figuring it out in play.
Mm-hmm.
And so if they have more of a foundation of that play when they're young, between like 4 and 6, they can pull from those ideas of like, oh yes, and making inferences. When this happens, I bet this will happen next. And we see this with our autistic students who struggle with social inferences. They also struggle with some social connections when they're younger because they tend to be somewhat concrete or literal thinkers, and they may miss some of the unwritten social cues of the interaction. But the same thing happens when they start into the reading comprehension. They struggle with perspective taking. So it makes sense that those things are harder. But even with neurotypical kids, if they aren't exposed to all the play and we're pushing reading earlier, I just truly believe it's why we get more behavioral dysregulation early into school and why it can make that K through time so hard for some of our neurodivergent students.
Yeah. And I think even talking to my friends who have, some neurotypical children, they have this mentality of more curriculum and more structure and more academics earlier is better. Like that's the way to do it. Like when I have these just kind of personal conversations with people, I get this vibe that that's what is thought of as being better. And from my own experiences and from the reading I've done, it's usually the opposite. It's usually more play, more flexibility, more openness that sets that stage, like you said, for them to then be able to learn at the ages.
Yeah, the research is really clear. Their brains are not ready to do this higher order thinking of literacy and math until their brains are ready to do it. And so you can't force that on a brain. It's about being developmentally ready to learn it. And the research is really clear that it's unusual when a 3-year-old can read. And in some autistic populations, kids will teach themselves to read, and it's called hyperlexia. So they're reading, they have like strengths and decoding skills, and they're reading everything, but they may not be understanding what they're reading. And that's actually an unusual development to develop that early. And many parents may think, well, my child is gifted at reading, but it may actually be that their development is asynchronous. So they've got these strong reading skills, but not the social comprehension skills with it. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a different order of development. And we need to be understanding that and figuring out what that child needs to keep moving forward with that unique development of their reading. But yes, I mean, it's, if you ask any child psychologist, they are going to say, play as long as you can so that your child can organically problem solve. Things will organically go wrong and they figure it out and they work together. They ask for help. These are all skills that kindergarten teachers say they wish their students had even more than the academics. They will teach the academics and they'll get the academics done. But I always say to parents, if you're choosing like a preschool for your 4-year-old, still focus on play-based. The academics will happen and there's so much time for them to learn that, but there's not going to always be time for them to play.
Yeah. I mean, within homeschool, I even extend that. I'm like, if you're not 7 or 8 yet, like just play, read to them, sing, run, play. And I've seen that be the thing that helps them prepare for that interest and that love of learning, where they're just like really invested in like, oh, I love this and I want to learn more about this. And they're just curious about the world around them. And it seems to come from the seedbed of play and of just like flexibility and openness. So
because play is emotionally regulating, and we have to be emotionally regulated and feel safe in order to learn. If not, we're just memorizing stuff.
Oh, yes. Okay. I need to pause at that because I think that so many times we're like trying to teach our kids in the heat of the moment when they're freaking out and we're freaking out at home. And then also again at school, right? Where the child is super dysregulated and we're like, no, but we have to learn. But their learning center is like not even open. Like it's just not, it's not going to happen.
So literally how this works in the brain is that generally speaking, we have 3 regions of the brain. We've got our limbic system, which is our brainstem, and we have our brain stem, which is our fight or flight. And then we've got our limbic system, which is like our emotional state. And then we've got our upper cortex, which is our executive functioning. Our executive functioning and our frontal lobe, and I'm pointing to my head like everyone can see me, but your forehead and the top of your brain, where all your language and your problem solving and your higher order thinking, all of that doesn't fully develop till we're 25. Okay. So this is why kids are impulsive. This is why kids don't make good decisions. This is why kids say things that they don't mean, all of that. When we are completely emotionally regulated, we can access that upper cortex. And when we're calm and feeling safe and connected, that's where the learning happens. But if we're in our emotional brain, that midbrain, this is when we're frustrated. We might tear something up. We might still be talking, but it might not be kind. And then when we're in our brainstem, we're in fight or flight and we're shut down. And this is when you feel like you can't even reach a child, right? So most everyone knows I can't teach this child if they're in shutdown, right? But where we get into trouble is when we start trying to push or trying to negotiate when a child is in their emotional midbrain and when their child is feeling overwhelmed, and we still think by talking more, we can get something in, and it's not necessarily true. This is when we need to slow it down and slow down the pace and help that child feel regulated and safe, and then go back to the learning.
Yes. Oh my goodness. This is so good. Yes to all of this. And I think this is true in the home also, right? When we're like, but I need to teach them that this behavior is important or this behavior is not okay. But you're like, yelling at them and they're yelling back at you. Like that is just not happening. And I've always known like, okay, the learning center in the brain is shut down, but I love that you broke it down like that. Okay. So another topic I want to talk about is anxiety, because I think that's probably the most present thing that I see in my friends and their kids and the school system and literally everybody that I talk to ever. It's like kids nowadays are just dealing with a lot of anxiety. And I think part of it is this idea of like, well, we don't want to enable them too much, right? Like some teachers are really just like, oh, well, everybody has it. So like, of course, you're just going to say you have anxiety to like get out of whatever you're trying to get out of. So I think it's this balance between how do I support them? How do I help kiddos with anxiety? What's happening here? But also, like you said, how do I help them to self-advocate and to be confident? So I'm sure you deal with this all the time. So I would love for you to talk on that.
Yeah. And of course, our neurodivergent kids have a higher level of anxiety than neurotypical kids, but many neurotypical kids are also experiencing anxiety. There are generational shifts and differences in our parenting styles to this. And I think every parenting generation kind of has a new thing that we do or that we are reading about. I do think that kids are more anxious for lots of reasons, but a few of them would be back to the play. I think that they're playing less. And so they are naturally experiencing less like setbacks in a safe situation, like falling down and getting hurt, dealing with the emotion that happens, brushing themselves off and going on. That is a little moment that their brain has processed that was scary, but I'm okay. So if you imagine that never happening to you because your parent is watching you all the time and never letting you fall, literally and figuratively, or if a parent is constantly telling you, oh, you're okay, and dismissing you, then it can become a feeling of, am I okay? Is it okay to have these feelings? And we all have anxiety. We all need anxiety to stay alive. This is from an evolutionary standpoint, anxiety keeps us alive because millions of years ago, if a tiger were on the loose and running after us, we are biologically wired to run. The problem now is that we're not being chased by tigers and we're having feelings like we are. And so we have to help kids understand you need a little bit of anxiety to motivate you, to help you remember to study for that test, to help you to stop and look right and left before you cross the street. We need that level of anxiety. That's healthy. There's a healthy level of anxiety. But if anxiety is stopping our child from participating in things that would either help them grow and learn or that they enjoy, then we're moving into a more clinical representation of anxiety that we want to help that child reduce. because that is not sustainable to live with that level of anxiety. So we often have to think about our own anxiety as parents because they're taking cues from us. If we are anxious about something, they're getting the message that, oh, this is something I should worry about, because I look up to my mom and she like knows what to do about stuff and she's worried about this thing. So I always encourage parents to be cautious about things you're openly anxious about. Now they're picking up on our cues too. So it's not just about not talking about it, but kind of check yourself and notice like, this is really bothering me. I think I want to get support for myself so that I can feel more capable navigating when there's a problem with, to solve with my child, or helping kids know when something's not their responsibility and that's not their role. Like, for instance, if a child has a sibling who maybe has a lot of behavior and the sibling tries to take on some of that parental roles, we would want the sibling to know that's not your job. You can go play with your friends. This is my job as a parent. So there are lots of things that come up that we can set boundaries for our kids. We can help teachers know that. Now, and this is what I often say to parents, as like, ask your child's teacher if they see this as well, because that is the easiest way to figure out the difference between a child's skill level and a child's like fatigue, or I'm just tired and I don't want to do it. Because if a child can do it at school, teachers tend to not enable because they don't have time to do anything for anybody. So if a child is able to be independent on something at school, but they never do it at home, that's how we can kind of figure out, okay, they're capable of it. So this skill's got to be emerging. So how can I translate some of that success to home and not feel so worried about them not, being able to do this skill or meet this milestone, because they're doing it at school. So they are capable.
Yeah. And I think when you said like there's a few reasons for anxiety popping up, I just finished reading a book where they also talked about like us not putting our kids in dangerous situations. Like the world's actually like technically and like literally more safe than it has been in decades. But we don't act as if it is because we have so much information and access to information and feel like it's a lot more unsafe. And so we don't just let kids, walk to the park by themselves or walk to school by themselves. Like there's not a lot of, like you said, it's a lot more like we're kind of hovering over and, managing those things. But then again, I also think screens that could be its own podcast episode, but I'll just suggest that you go read Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. I haven't read the whole thing yet, but I have read little clips of it. And I'm like, okay, I think that whole thing, could be 7 podcast episodes, but there's differences in our society now that are tending to more anxiety in our kids. And so I think it's important to kind of understand that. And on the one hand, be compassionate and loving and accepting and helping our kids, but also, like you said, is this a skill that they do know how to do? Can I help them? And for me, it's always obvious. Like I have this one kiddo who has super, super high anxiety, always in social situations. So doesn't want to leave the house, doesn't want to go to the grocery store, doesn't want to go play with friends, even if they actually do want to go play with friends. And I had put them in this alternative school that was very open and very flexible. And for the first little bit, I felt like, okay, I think this is a really good push. It's kind of a little bit out there for him, but also like it's a good push. But I could tell over time that it became detrimental. Like it became to the point where the anxiety was too much. It was too significant. It was just pushing him too much. And so I think part of that for us as parents and as teachers is knowing that balance of, what can they do and what can I help them kind of encourage and growth in this area, but also not so much that it's going to just really dysregulate them and end up being kind of traumatic for them.
Yep. It's finding that window of tolerance and also accepting that that window of tolerance moves day to day based on sleep and based on fatigue and stress, and sometimes even how a child is physically feeling, if they're constipated or if they have a sore throat or if they have a headache. These are things that make all of us feel, have lower stamina, feel like we have less energy, and kids can't always identify that or tell us that. So we have to just stay curious about, gosh, they had this skill yesterday, but they're not doing it today. I wonder what's going on. And that just means that a skill is still emerging. Anything that is mastered and kind of on autopilot, they can still do if they're tired. I mean, think about a child who, even if they're tired or cranky, they know how to put on their shoes versus a child who just learned how to put on their shoes. They may just lay in the floor and not feel like doing it that day because it's not an automatic skill. So I always separate skills into like the mastered kind of automatic skills. And then in the middle is like these emerging learning skills. And then that third category is like things you're not even expecting your child to do developmentally yet. And some of that may be surprising given their age, but that's okay if they're they're all developing on their own path, but if they're developing in some asynchronous ways that are different from the chronological age of their peers, that's okay. And if we push those things, it would stress them out more and they wouldn't be able to learn.
Yes. Okay. I wish that we had so much time for me to ask you so many more questions, but the one thing I want to make sure we touch on is, if parents are like feeling like, okay, yeah, I'm pretty inclusive to my kids. I kind of understand, what they're going through and I can kind of help support them at home, but I'm not necessarily feeling like I'm getting that support in the school setting. What can they do to either advocate for their kids or when to know when maybe that school setting isn't ideal for them? Like when they're like, oh, maybe we need to actually look into private school, alternative school, homeschooling, something else, because there's no change happening where we need it. Like, how do people navigate that?
Yeah, I think the first question to get to the bottom of is checking in with school staff on how they think it's going. And if it's really different from how you think it's going, like that's a little bit of a yellow flag of trying to figure out, well, if you don't think your child is making either academic progress or behavioral progress. So if they're making academic progress and you see growth over the year, that's what we want to see, right? Because we're probably seeing more maturity emotionally and behaviorally and more academic progress, that kind of goes hand in hand. But if we're seeing lots of emotional dysregulation or anxiety about school and it's not getting better, that's when we need to be collaborating about what is it about the environment. And usually when we talk to teachers, if there's a lot of anxiety at school, they'll be able to help us understand when is it happening? Where is it happening? Like, what is the pattern to the frustration and the upset? Is it certain subjects? Is it certain times of day? Is this child really only have the stamina for about 3 or 4 hours and the afternoon is always hard? Like, or is school fine? And then they get home and they fall apart. That's a thing too, because they hold it together all day and then they fall apart. And sometimes teachers are like, everything's going fine here. And you're like, yeah, but this is what it looks like at home. And I just want you to know how hard my kid is pushing. So sometimes it's just getting on the same page about what your child looks like at home versus at school. But if you feel like your child's not progressing or you feel like your child is misunderstood and you've really tried to explain developmentally what's going on. And of course, you're going to have specialists involved because schools have psychologists and speech language pathologists and occupational therapists who should be on your child's team if they have a neurodivergence like autism or ADHD or even anxiety, which in and of itself is not a neurodivergence, but lots of kids with neurodivergence have lots of anxiety. If you just feel like there's something structurally about the school day or the building or the size of the school in terms of population that's not a fit for your child, you may want to start thinking about, if you have the resources, to doing something different. There's some families that don't have the resources and they just really lean into advocating at school. And in the States, we have, special education programs where a child can learn in a smaller group and they're learning the same curriculum, but it's in a smaller group. And sometimes the size of the group matters. Sometimes the noise of the group situation matters. Sometimes, the timing of things. So they're all different things we can tweak about how the child is learning and the environment and like the overwhelm that we're seeing, but we have to get to the bottom of what is it about that specific child that's overwhelming and shutting down their learning, and how can we start problem solving, changing that. And so that's what I would start thinking about as a parent when we talk about school fit. There are some families I work with where we change this child's school environment and so many of their frustrations melts away because it was about how big the school was or how fast paced it was or how many kids were in a room or the something about the sensory of the noises at the school. So there are all kinds of things you can problem solve to figure out.
I love that. And I think also, being open to different alternative options for kids, kind of knowing like how much structure do they need? How much do they not? And I would also offer for those of you that are like, okay, I'm feeling like maybe homeschool is a good option. Like I kind of want to try it out, but also I feel like I can't. I think one thing that Emily and I talked about before was like, just take it 1 year at a time. Like I would have never decided to homeschool if I was like, I'm going to do it for 12 years till this kid graduates. When I took him home from grade 1, I said, I'm going to do it till grade 3. He's going back into school at grade 3. And that was always my kind of like going into it. And so then by grade 3, when I was like, okay, it's going pretty well, I'm going to do it for this 1 year. And every year I decide what's best for them, for their love of learning, for how they're doing behaviorally and emotionally. And that has changed every single year. And I've done lots of different ways of schooling every single year. And I think just being flexible with that. What does this child need right now? What do I want to do just this year? So don't feel like if you're feeling called to homeschool or to try it for a year, that it's something you have to just sign on to for the rest of your life.
Right. And the same goes for staying in public school or staying in, a private school that you're not sure has enough support for your child. If you feel like there's something going for it, like, well, first of all, for public school, it's going to be free. You got that going for it. But also that your child, won't be asked to leave public school because they have a right to be there versus in private school. In America, they have, they don't have to serve you if they don't have the strategies or the staff to serve you. And so that's something that parents will decide, like, I don't want my kid to be asked to leave a school I can't put them in that situation. And so they will go public instead of private, or, these are all decisions to think about. And your kid best. Everyone listening knows their kid best. And like we were talking about before, you only know the kid right in front of you. You don't know the kid who's going to be, 3 or 4 years from now, a different age, a different maturity level, have different skills. I've just seen it over time with my own kids who were ages 10 and 16. Like I just have seen so much growth in them that if you had, told me 10 years ago that my 16-year-old would be doing what he's doing now, I probably would have cried and like not believed you. But at the same time, it's so rewarding to actually let it be a mystery and let them surprise you and just take it 1 year at a time.
I teared up when you said that because I'm like, that is my exact experience. Like I would have never guessed even 5 years ago that we would be where we are right now and that things would be going so well, especially behaviorally and emotional regulation and confidence and all those things. Because those things matter as much as school and academics matter. Like if you talk to an employer, I've been going to job fairs with my oldest son because he's going to college soon. And every single time he would go to a booth and he would ask them, like, what kind of skills do you look for? Like, what are you looking for? It was never academic skills. Not one of them said that. Every single one said, it's the personality. It's do we get along with them? Can we connect with them? Like they use different words, but in my mind, I was like, they're saying emotional intelligence. Like that's what they're looking for. Anybody can do the academic side of it, right? We can learn how to do that side of it. And after the one job fair, he came home and he said, I feel a lot better about things now. Cause I was all worried that I wasn't going to have, these skills and stuff. He's like, but they seem to care so much more about, what they called personality, but really it's not personality. It's confidence and self-regulation. It's social and emotional skills. So those things never feel like those aren't important. Like if your kiddo's not doing the greatest in academic skills, like that's okay. That's all right. Like, let's just work on this social and emotional stuff. And the others will come developmentally. Like
it'll come just like the play, keep playing until they're ready to learn.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. This was really helpful. And I would love for you to tell our listeners where they can connect with you, especially if they feel like their school is not necessarily inclusive when it comes to neurodivergent learners. I think tell us about that.
So how I say it is we are all neurodiverse as a population and some of us are neurodivergent. So that's how I use those two different terms. So I provide professional development for K through 12. It's generally in the mainstream schools, but all are welcome, of course. But most of what I coach on, special education teachers know all of this already. But generally speaking, either virtually or in person to K-12 teachers wanting to understand how to meet the needs of neurodivergent kids in their classrooms. So anyone listening can go to learnwithdremily.com for that information. I also do monthly parent workshops online and have a parent community on Substack, which is at learnwithdremily.substack.com.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So if you are feeling like your kiddo's not getting what they need in the school system, or you want to help advocate for them more in the school system, I think this is such a great resource. Also, just convince your school to like bring her in and be like, wait,
I'd love that.
Let's help all the teachers figure this out.
And you can follow me on social, on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. It's at Emily W. King, PhD.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for being here. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, I would love for you to help spread the word by getting this message of support and guidance out to as many people as possible. So text it to your best friend or tag me on Instagram and share it. Leave a review, rate it, subscribe it, or follow on your favorite platform. Send me a DM on IG letting me know which parts have impacted you or what you'd like to see on future episodes. We'll see you next week.